So now we'll start presentations on management of the Great Salt Lake. Our next speaker is Dr. Thomas Bosteels from the Great Salt Lake Brine Shrimp Cooperative, who will present on the history of the sustainable harvest management on the Great Salt Lake. Thomas, you have the floor.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Patrick. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, good evening for the people across the world. Thanks for the opportunity for us to give a little bit more of an in-depth view on the history of the sustainable management of the Great Salt Lake ecosystem. What I'd like to do first is give somewhat of a history of the sustainable harvest management on Great Salt Lake. So when did it all start? It started in the early 1990s. There was truly increased harvest pressure on the Great Salt Lake. There were more vessels being constructed and used. There were more permits being issued. The equipment that was being used became more sophisticated. And the state at the time really didn't have a formal program to protect the brine shrimp resource. And the state really didn't do a lot of research with regard to brine shrimp at the time either. And frankly, at that time, there was really no mandate for the state to regulate the brine shrimp harvest. During the early 1990s, there were a lot of concerns about overfishing. These concerns spanned the globe, really. Just to give some examples, the Peruvian and Chovy fisheries that crashed in the 70s. We know the sole fisheries in the Irish Sea and in the English Channel became or virtually collapsed. Here in the US, the blue walleye went extinct in the Great Lakes. And then we experienced the collapse of the cod fisheries on the east coast of the United States and Canada somewhere in the early 90s. And I just want to point your attention to that. If you look at the graph in the top right-hand corner, that is a graph of the cod fisheries. And you can sort of see that the cod fishery was slowly increasing up until more or less the 60s. And then there was really an exponential increase followed by a crash. And the reason that crash took place is because of the type of equipment that was being used. These factory trawlers that were decimating the cod stocks, but not just the cod stocks, also the food chain, really, the what the cod eat and what the cod eat and what the cod eat and so on. And by the early 90s, those cod stocks had completely collapsed on the east coast of the United States and Canada. And interestingly, a lot of the companies that were harvesting on the Great Salt Lake were also active in these marine fisheries. So this was very much front and center for these companies. So the industry, as a result of that, took an initiative and approached the Division of Wildlife Resources, the then director, Bob Valentine, and expressed those different concerns. Questions that came up: can the Division of Wildlife Resources, manage the lake? As an industry, we really don't want to overfish the resource. How do we accomplish that? How can we protect the resource long-term, not just short-term? Are there really enough cysts in the lake for the type of equipment and the amount of equipment and permits that are being issued? And then what kind of a management structure could be put in place? Are we talking about a quota or another management structure? The division itself had some questions as well about the greater fauna around the Great Salt Lake, and they had a big question about funding. And funding was an issue. There was really no money available to do this research, to put a program together like that. So the industry then agreed to increase their permit fees in order to be able to fund that research. And with that funding in place and the support of the industry, the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources then established the Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Program. And it's a program that has as role to manage the Artemia resource and the Great Salt Lake ecosystem. So not just the Artemia resource, but the whole ecosystem. The division then also established a technical advisory group. And the technical advisory group, we'll talk more about it here in a minute, but it's basically a science peer review committee that advises the ecosystem program on the research that it should be doing, the research it is doing, and the outcomes of that research helps analyze those outcomes. Interestingly, the division then was also able to leverage some of those funds by making agreements with other state and federal agencies, and in that way allow for even more research to be done. So let's take a look at the Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Project and the Technical Advisory Group as it started. So you had the Division of Wildlife Resources with their program, the Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Program, that was doing a lot of sampling, looking at Artemia demographics, starting to look at some phytoplankton and abiotic factors. Also involved at the time was the Utah State University, and they were involved on the level of harvest management and avian research. So really creating a model for harvest management. The United States Geological Survey was primarily doing work on hydrology, inflows, and nutrients. And then our own brine shrimp industry was doing a lot of sampling, looking at the Artemia demographics and also the abiotic factors. So that's the initial steps. That's how it started. With the few years of research data, the state then established a sustainable management model. And the model is based on an escapement stock of Artemia cysts to assure that there's an optimal emergence of the Artemia population each spring. So let's take a closer look at the sustainable harvest model. The harvest model is it's sort of a modified Ricker curve, a modified stock recruitment curve, if you want. If you look at the white background, the graph with a white background here at top right-hand corner, you can see that in the x-axis, you will find the cysts per liter that are left in the lake post-harvest. And then on the y-axis, you can see the projected cysts per liter that will be produced in the fall as a function of the escapement stock. And interestingly, it's sort of a typical recruitment curve where there is somewhere an optimal escapement stock. And in this case, that is the escapement stock is approximately 21 cysts per liter. So the management is not based on a quota, but it is truly based on an escapement stock. And the division will continue to sample the lake during the harvest. And once that escapement stock is reached, the 21 cysts per liter, the harvest will be halted, will be stopped. Now, interestingly, here is after 25 years of implementing this management system, and after all the additional research that has been done, and with that research, that escapement stock recruitment curve has been adjusted. You can still see that the actual optimal escapement stock hasn't deviated a lot from the 21 cysts per liter as it was first implemented in 1997. And therefore, that 21 cysts per liter today is still the rule that the industry goes by. So let's take a look at what has happened since, because those were the early years, the establishment of that harvest model. But in the meantime, in the last couple of decades, a lot of additional work has been done on the Great Salt Lake ecosystem, and a lot more research was implemented. A few additional members joined the technical advisory group. The University of Notre Dame is an example, who have done more recently a lot of work on microbialites. but also are really focused on modeling, not just modeling of the harvest management, but modeling of the whole resource. Westminster College has also been added to that group, and they study the microbialites, and they also do some avian research. And then all the groups that are part of the tag have also expanded the research that they've been doing. And let's take a look at this research. Of course, Artemia demographics are still a very important part of the research. The avian fauna has become very significant in terms of the research projects that are being done. Microbialites and brine fly research, that's come up more recently in the last 5 to 10 years, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. And then ecosystem modeling. So rather than only modeling the harvest management itself, the modeling has now expanded throughout the whole ecosystem. And then more recently, the work on nutrients and on salinity have become very important. Let me talk a little bit about the Artemia demographics and the research projects that are out there. The Division of Wildlife Resources and the industry have somewhat similar programs running in parallel, but they are complementary as well. Just by way of example, I'll discuss the program that the industry right now has implemented, so our cooperative. Just to give you an example, we sample about every 2 to 3 weeks. So we do about 24 lake surveys, and every lake survey involves sampling at 12 different locations. Throughout a 24-month period, we will take more than 190 population samples, more than 120 phytoplankton samples, more than 190 chlorophyll samples, and so on and so on. So you can see it's quite an extensive program, and the Division of Wildlife Resources has a somewhat similar program as ours. Now, where the cooperative may put a little bit more emphasis on salinity, dormancy, also nutrients analysis and genetic analysis of phytoplankton, the division has a little bit stronger focus on overwintering survival, spatial variability, microbialites, and brine flies. The important thing to note here is that the industry, our cooperative, shares the findings from our program with the state. So these become really complementary and help understand the greater ecosystem in more detail, if you want. Let me talk a bit about Artemia demographics. We could have a whole presentation on any of these topics, frankly. And of course, the Artemia demographics are very important in a hypersaline system. But with our sampling, we look at all the different age classes. We track those age classes. We look at overwintering survival, hatchability, dormancy. We do a lot of phytoplankton analysis, and we look at how the phytoplankton and the brine shrimp population interact. We obviously also look at the cyst count, and then we compare all of these data with the state's data and share that data with the state. So that's just a very brief overview of the Artemia demographics and the sampling program that we have as a cooperative, and that also the state of Utah has implemented. Now, another area of research that's become very important for the state is the avian research. And why is that so important? Well, the Great Salt Lake is truly a world hemispheric reserve. We have 7.5 million birds that represent more than 250 species that utilize the lake. A couple of examples where Artemia is really important is for the eared grebes. We have about 2.5 million eared grebes on the Great Salt Lake. That is about half of the North American population. We also have 20,000 breeding adult pelicans on the lake. We have 500,000 phalaropes. It is the single largest staging concentration in the world, and it represents a third of the world's phalarope population. And so the Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Project really coordinates all the research that's going on with regard to the avian populations. And here's something that's really interesting is because the harvest management of Artemia is really designed to optimize the Artemia production and the Artemia population on the lake. It also supports an optimal avian population that relies on that Artemia on Great Salt Lake. Again, there can be a whole presentation given just about the avian research, but there are a lot of papers, publications that have come out with regard to avian research on the Great Salt Lake, if people are interested to take another look at that. That brings me to microbialites, brine flies, and ecosystem modeling. Microbialites they're these living structures, these structures of calcium and magnesium carbonate that are really produced by cyanobacteria under certain conditions. And interestingly, the Great Salt Lake has very, very large fields of these microbialites, primarily on its periphery. And it's only in the last decade, maybe not even a full 10 years, that the research on the microbialites has really intensified. It started with Dr. Baskins, who mapped all of these microbialites on the Great Salt Lake, and then that research has extended with many researchers looking at how nutrients are cycled through these microbialites. And a couple of interesting findings is that these microbialites appear to be a very important source of nutrition for brine flies, but also for Artemia during oligotrophic periods in the lake. So there seems to be a period of time where Artemia actually also uses the algae that are being produced by these microbialites. So very interesting research that's ongoing, especially with regard to nutrient cyclings and the role of microbialites in the greater Great Salt Lake ecosystem. More recently, also, Dr. Bolovsky, who initiated the first harvest management model, has been expanding the modeling of Great Salt Lake, of the Great Salt Lake ecosystem, looking at all the abiotic factors, at nutrients, at phytoplankton, microbialites, brine flies, Artemia, water birds, corixids. So really all of the different trophic levels in both the benthic and the pelagic regions of the lake. And the goal there, again, this research is supported by the state of Utah. And again, the goal is to provide additional tools to ultimately improve the management of the Great Salt Lake ecosystem. So where are we today? There are several TAG members that are doing independent research. The state itself is doing independent research. That research is obviously being shared between these groups. But what we've started to see also is that these groups are working collaboratively together on certain projects that they're then sharing with the TAG members. And we've seen some other groups, both state agencies and research groups, that are starting to do independent research and interact with the different TAG members. These are not per se TAG members themselves, but they play a very important role in studying the Great Salt Lake ecosystem, and there's a lot of interaction between these different groups. So some of the conclusions that we can come up with, let me first conclude on Artemia per se. If you look at this graph, it represents the Artemia harvest over the last 25 years. And what you can see in the blue lines on the graph represent the dry equivalent Artemia harvest. And interestingly, since the introduction of the management model in the mid to late 1990s, what we've seen is a reduction in the variability of the harvest of Artemia cysts on Great Salt Lake, and also a slight increase in the total harvest of Artemia cysts on Great Salt Lake. And that's really representative, if you want, of the success of the management system that was put in place. With regard to Artemia, after 25 years of research, we can say that we now do have a sustainable brine shrimp resource that does supply both the avian population and our industry with important Artemia, but it does so while preserving the healthy and sustainable population of Artemia on the Great Salt Lake. And what I would really like to end this this part of our presentation with is that the success of this management of the Great Salt Lake Artemia population, but more importantly, the whole Great Salt Lake ecosystem, could really not have happened without the true collaboration and true stakeholder improvement. And yes, it started with the Artemia industry going to the state and asking the state to implement a system, but the ultimate success of that management system is truly the result of the collaboration and the involvement of all the different stakeholders.